Aspects of Aristotle in this video and his philosophy. The first is his metaphysics, his view of reality. And for Aristotle, reality is physical objects. There's a famous painting by Raphael called The School of Athens, and in the center are Plato and Aristotle. Plato, the older man, Aristotle was his student. Plato is pointing up. Reality is ideas. The real table is the idea or form of a table. Aristotle, his younger student, is pointing down. No, Plato, reality is down here. For Aristotle, reality is physical objects with four causes. The first is the formal cause. This is his bow to his teacher. Yes, Plato, in order for there to be a table, there first has to be the idea of a table. But where Plato thought the idea was in itself enough to cause physical objects to come into existence as shadows or copies of the real thing, which is the idea. For Aristotle, you need more than just the idea. You also need the material cause, the stuff that it's made of. Okay, the material cause of a table is likely to be wood. But just having the idea of table and having the material is still not enough to cause a table. You also need the efficient cause, the maker, the person who shapes the material into the form. Now, most people would probably think that those three things are enough. But that's not the way that Aristotle thinks. And really much of Aristotle's philosophy in other aspects ties into the fourth cause, what he calls the final cause, the goal, the end, the purpose for which something is made or for which it exists. The Greek word he uses is telos, and so this idea is called teleology. The telos of a table is to hold objects that we're using. Our food while we're eating, our books, our laptop while we're working on our classwork. Those are the causes for everything that exists. Everything has these four causes. Now, what that leads to is that Aristotle is going to analyze things both in terms of the world and in terms of ethics, how we as human beings ought to live, is going to think in terms of the goal, the end, the purpose of things. The universe has a goal towards which it is moving. We have a goal of fulfilling our human nature, our human essence in life. And we'll talk about that at another time. But when it comes to his understanding of the world, this telos, at some point at least in the development of Western thought, gets tied into his concept of motion in the universe because of how he explains motion. In fact, this becomes part of the medieval concept of God. Now, what Aristotle does, this is the way that Greek proto-science worked. The scientific method you learned about in school has only happened since the Renaissance. In fact, in Western culture, we read part of the birth of modern science in Francis Bacon. In Greek science, Aristotle simply observes motion in the world. For example, the sun moves across the sky during the day. The moon moves across the sky at night. Well, what's causing this motion? In Greek proto-science, you observe and then you speculate. What might be behind this? And Aristotle is working with a view of the world that he didn't invent, he inherited, in which the earth was in the center and there were a series of concentric spheres surrounding it, kind of like the layers of an onion, or those little Russian dolls where there's a little one and then there's a bigger one in two pieces that fits around it, and then there's an even bigger one in two pieces that fits around it. And so these spheres have attached to them lights, the moon, the planets, the sun, the stars. You know, I know you've all been taught that until 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, everybody thought the world was flat. There's just one itsy-bitsy problem with that. It's not true. In ancient Greek and Roman times, educated people at least thought that the world was round, was the center of the universe with this series of concentric spheres, with the earth in the middle and each of the spheres extending out from that. Now, like I said, Aristotle did not invent that view. He inherited it. What he adds is an explanation for movement. And that explanation is something like this. Beyond this world, the physical universe, there is a being of pure intellect. The highest kind of being that we can envision. And he calls this the Unmoved Mover. Now, the Unmoved Mover pays no attention to the world. The world is beneath its notice. It is doing the highest activity that there is, contemplation. The Greek word is theoria, from which we get our words like theory, theorem, theoretical. It is contemplating. What's it contemplating? It's contemplating itself, contemplating itself, contemplating itself. And so there is this circular pattern to the unmoved mover's thoughts. Well, these spheres were thought of as kind of elemental or rudimentary spirits. They are, in fact, the elemental spirits, principalities, and powers mentioned in the New Testament, which comes from a time about 300 to 400 years after Aristotle, but this view of the world is still very much in place. And so the outermost sphere senses the presence of the unmoved mover and admires it. And it does what we do when we admire or look up to someone. It copies them. If you have a younger sibling, especially a younger sibling of the same gender as yourself, this probably annoyed the fire out of you growing up. Ladies, your little sister wants to try on your dresses, your shoes. I remember my brother's 8 years younger than I am. And so, when I was in high school, I was shaving, and he was 8, and he would come in and play with the shaving cream. And of course, being so young, he didn't have enough sense to cover his tracks. So I would go in there, and there'd be a big loop of shaving cream hanging out of the can, And so I knew, he'd been fiddling with it. Because they're younger, they want to be like you, they try to copy you, but because they're younger, they can't quite pull it off. Well, that's what this outermost sphere is like. It tries to copy this circular pattern of the unmoved mover's thoughts. And the closest it can come to copy that is to spin in a circle, to move in a circular pattern. Well, the next sphere in then senses that and copies it and starts spinning and moving. And so the next sphere in copies, and so on, all the way in. And that, Aristotle says, is why we see movement in the universe. After all, inanimate objects we don't normally think of as moving. If all of a sudden your desk shuffled out of the room, you would probably think that called for some explanation. And that's what Aristotle provided, an explanation for movement that we observe in the sky. Now, why this is important is when we get to the Middle Ages, Aristotle's unmoved mover becomes Thomas Aquinas' prime or first mover. Part of the medieval concept of God. After all, it's a commonplace until modern thought that there could not be an infinite regress. That, there has to be, if there's motion in the world, as there obviously is, there has to be, things don't ordinarily move themselves. Something else causes them to move, right? If you've ever shot pool, okay, the solid and striped balls move because they're struck by the cue ball. Well, what made the cue ball start moving? Well, somebody made a motion. It was hit by the cue stick. Well, what made the cue stick move? Somebody made a motion with their arm that caused the cue stick to move. You see, you get a chain of one thing putting another in motion, putting another in motion, putting another in motion. But for people from Aristotle in the 300s BC to Aquinas in the 1200s AD, this chain has to start somewhere. It can't go all the way back forever. And so Aristotle's unmoved mover becomes Aquinas' prime mover, because Aquinas bases much of his thought on Aristotle. In fact, it's Aquinas who calls Aristotle the philosopher. And so this unmoved mover becomes part of Aquinas' prime mover. And this vision of the world gets adopted by the medieval church. That's why Galileo got in trouble with the church when he started saying that no, the sun does not revolve around the earth. Rather, the earth revolves around the sun. Because this vision of the world, inherited from Greek and Roman times, had been adopted by the church because it fit in so well with the theology of Thomas Aquinas, who is still the most authoritative theologian in the Roman Catholic tradition. So understanding this about Aristotle now not only helps now for Aristotle, but will also help later on when we're talking about Thomas Aquinas and his proofs for the existence of God, because they're based on Aristotelian logic. See you next time.